The Indian Jewish Heritage Center, together with the Cucini Jewish Heritage Center in Nevatim, are very happy to host for the second time this year Mr. Ken Robbins for a talk on the African Nawabs of Janjira. For today's talk, we are very happy to host from his library Mr. Kennet X Robbins. Ken is a psychiatrist and a collector archivist. He's specializing in Maharajas, Nawabs, and other local regional Indian rulers. He also specializes in Indian minority groups, especially Jews and Africans. He published 11 books and more than 120 articles. He organized conferences and curated exhibits in India and the United States. His encyclopedic study of the Jews in India is documented so far in 3 volumes, and 5 more are under preparation. His exhibit and video on Indian Jews was shown in New Delhi's Indira National Center for Art, and his exhibit on Jews in Bollywood was shown in the American Sephardic Federation in New York. Ken is very much involved in the Indian Jewish community and is very known as respected by all members and all communities. Ken, the stage is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Avner. Thank you for all the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
I think some of you will probably think this will be a very, very short lecture. After all, how much information could there be on Indian Jews? Everybody has these images. One is, if there were Africans in India, they must have been slaves. But what is unique about India is that there were many places where Africans were the rulers or the people who actually governed the state. And one of those places was Janjira, where a lot of the Beni Israel originated from. In trying to deal with the question of both Africans and Jews, I've tried to do this by breaking it down into 4 categories. Category 1 is the history of the communities. And we see a volume about that on the left-hand side. In the middle, we see a volume about foreign Jews and all the accomplishments they made. And it's a great variety of people. On the right-hand side, we have a volume on Jews and Indian art. And we're going to be talking today about one of those artists, a Beni Israel who became the brother-in-law of the African Muslim Nawab of Janjira. I'm working now on 3 separate volumes about Jews, Muslims, and Islam in South Asia. You'd think that there wouldn't be any information. My problem is that there's too much information. And just yesterday, I came up with something new. If you want an account of a non-elite slave, African slave who came to India, the only personal reminiscence that we have are one name that came in the 16th century, named Gabriel. He came from Ethiopia. One of the extraordinary things about Gabriel is that he was born a Jew, a Beta Israel, and he was enslaved in Ethiopia and then became a Muslim as a slave and went back and forth between Portuguese and Sultanate regimes just north of Janjira. And we know about this because we have the records of his of the attention paid to him in 2 trials by the Inquisition as a lapsed Muslim. So it's a Jew who became a Muslim, Christian, and was eventually convicted by the Inquisition in India. When we talk about the Jews of India, many people who are not familiar with this know one of 2 things. They know that there were Jewish traders there, the Sassoons, and they know that there was a synagogue in Cochin. They don't know that that synagogue was the 3rd oldest of the 4 synagogues in that area, and there were other synagogues in that area as well. People who are not involved in this also don't know that the very largest Jewish community, the Beni Israel, we don't really know their origins. There are a lot of theories. They weren't even known to other Jews until the 18th century. And one of the Cochini Jews in 1768, his family had come the previous century from Aleppo, Syria, and he was in Cochin. And it's the first Jewish recognition of the Bnei Israel. They said they were tent dwellers and they make oil. What they're talking about here is vegetable oil. And they were known as the Saturday oil men because they rested on Saturday. And some of them were soldiers and they know nothing but the prayer of the Shema and they keep the Sabbath. So this is the first recognition by other Jews of the Bnei Israel community. But when you go to what is the first evidence that we have of the Bnei Israel community, it is in a decree that came from an African. Say, what was an African doing there? In the sultanates of that area, there were many Africans. They came as elite slaves and they took over as generals and prime ministers and strongmen. And the greatest of all of these was a fellow named Malik Ambar, who in the early 17th century was the chief opponent of the Mughal Empire. And the very first reference to the Shanwa Tali, the Saturday oil men who became the Bnei Israel, is in fact something from a decree of Malik Ambar. So you can see these two groups were connected in certain ways. The Bnei Israel were governed by three hereditary families of judges called Kashis or Qazis, and they were somewhat regulated by the Nawab of Janjira, as we can see from this document, which I won't give you the details, but the point is that the Nawab of Janjira was the one who determined who was the legitimate Qazi in this case. And that one of the families of hereditary Qazis came from Danda Rajpuri, near the famous island of Janjira. So when I went searching with a architectural historian from Pune and a Loki Bnei Israel to document all of these synagogues, we stopped at the palace of the African Nawab, and there's the man who would be the present African Nawab if there still was such a position. Now, a lot of you would say that this is going to be a very, very short story, but I think you can see there's so many variations on it that the thing is, how does one keep track of it? I try to sort them all out and give you all of the variations, but it's too complicated. And I'm going to trust you as the audience to realize that you shouldn't come away with one fact. You should come away with that these are communities, that their histories, the accomplishments of the people within that community were very complex. So we basically have three things that we're going to be talking about. One of the center is the Bnei Israel community, many of whom originated from Janjira's territory, though they went all over India. And one of them was the prime minister of, or the Karbari of Janjira in the late 19th century. And we're going to talk about Ahmed Khan, one of the African Nawabs, rulers. And in the right-hand side, you can see his brother-in-law, Faizi Rachamin, a Bnei Israel, who became a Muslim when he married his wife. His wife was one of the three Faizi sisters. One sister was married and divorced. The other sister was married to the Nawab of Janjira. And you're going to hear about the fabulous life that this Begum, the wife of the Nawab of Janjira, who was a Muslim but not an African, had. And you're going to hear about her dissatisfaction after her husband died and the diatribe that she wrote against her husband, which was converted into one of the great feminist novels written by her brother-in-law. So this is a male Muslim writing a feminist diatribe against the rule of men in the 1930s, which is obviously a volume that should be read. Now, one of the things is everybody has an image of what Africans are. And one of the assumptions we make many times, which I think is racist, is that if you find that an African did something, it's something unusual. But when you go back in the history of India, you'll see that the Habshi sultanates of Bengal in the 15th century were Africans. The sultanates of Bijapur and Ahmednagar, which were extremely powerful, were mainly under the control of Africans, even though they weren't the sultans. And that there were at least two princely states, Janjira, who we're going to hear about, and an offshoot of Janjira, which came into being in the late 18th century called Sachin. And so I've dealt with all of these things. The middle pamphlet is from an exhibit that I did with the New York Public Library Center for Black Culture. There's been over 40 venues, 5 continents, and was shown at the UN, UNESCO, the Indira Gandhi National Center for the Art. The Indian government showed it to all the African leaders. So what was the connection between the Jews and the Africans who lived in this place called Janjira? It was known as the Habshi Kingdom, Habshi meaning East African. The rulers were known as the Sidis, S-I-D-I, also meaning African. These were Muslims from East Africa. Most of the population was Hindu. So these are African Muslims ruling over Hindus. And in 1901, the number of Africans was 240. They were all elite Africans, so it wasn't really poor Africans. And there were at that time 566 Beni Israel living in those areas. But a larger percentage of the community, of the Beni Israel community, had originated from these areas. Many of them had already moved on to other places in India. And a 19th century missionary said that the small colony of Beni Israel had increased under protection of the Abyssinian chief who had settled there. On the right-hand side, we see them drawn as Arabs. They were great pirates. They were great navigators. They became the chief admirals of the Mughal Navy. And you can see the symbol of ship. And in the center, you see a castle, which represents their island fort, which was also known as Janjira. So it's like New York, New York, Janjira Island and Janjira State. This wonderful impregnable island is now in the hands of the Archaeological Survey of India. And it was attacked literally dozens of times by their enemies. Nobody could ever breach this thing. And in the 17th and 18th century, they were extremely powerful sailors. On the island itself, which has its own fresh water supply, there was a whole city. So where was this? And I'm going to ask you to bear with me because I didn't have a map that made it quite clear. If you start and look at the bottom right of the map, you'll see Janjira in 2 ways. You'll see Janjira in lowercase letters representing the island, and below Janjira in capitals representing the state, you'll see Sribardan, which is the southernmost part of Janjira state. Above that, you see Alibag and Chol. Alibag was the naval center for the Marathas, the Hindus. It was also the center of the Portuguese and also the center of the Beni Israel. So just north of this, everybody recognizes that these were places where the Beni Israel were. If you go a little further north, you come to Bombay. And if you go all the way to the top in pink, you'll see the sailors of Janjira's navy went all the way to Surat in the 17th and 18th century, where they had tremendous power in this city, which was the biggest port in India at the time. And they were the chief admirals of the Mughal Navy, the only substantial navy in India. And at one point in the late 18th century, Africans set up a second state called Sachin, which was there. And if one goes across the Gulf of Cambay, you see the blue, you'll see in the lower right-hand corner of the area in yellow, Jafirabad. Jafirabad was the center of another part of Janjira state. So these are people who had 22 forts. They were the big Mughal admirals. They were powerful in the most important port in India, and they developed yet another part of their state in the 17th and 18th century. By the 19th century, their technology on boats was outmoded. They really didn't have power. They were not powerful. the conditions in the state were poor and chaotic, with members of the African elite killing each other, trying to get power, and so on and so forth, until the British reestablished peace. So when one looks at the map of Janjira, one sees some things that are very interesting. Now, if you look at the map on the right, you see Mumbai, where there are a number of synagogues, and going all the way from Thane to Srivardhan are various Jewish synagogues, and of which Borli, Nangaon, Srivardhan, and Masla were in Janjira state. Some of the other areas to the right of Murad, which was the capital, also at times under the control of these Africans. Other times they were in control of their enemies. We went looking for cemeteries, and what would happen is we would come to a road, and our Beni Israel guide would suddenly, there was nothing there, just land off the side of the road. We go walking through brush for 2 or 3 blocks, equivalent of 2 or 3 blocks, and we find an area with a few tombstones, and you can barely see it, Israeli mourning candles. But these are, you see on the right, so far we found 39 synagogues, 35 cemeteries in the Konkan. This means in Janjira and the area north of Janjira. And really, we don't find any below the southern border of Janjira. So where did they live? Did they live mostly in the capital? Yeah, there were people who lived in the capital of Murad. But Murad only had a private prayer hall. They lived in the villages. And we've outlined a few of the villages where we found these people. And how do we know that they came from these villages? Because they have names like Talkar and Mazlikar that are based on the particular place they came from. There was no town that had, or village that had a Jewish majority, and everywhere they pressed vegetable oil. So here's a partial list of all the names that we were able to come with so far. So if we went and we found a person whose name Gazulkar, we knew that they came from, their ancestors came from there. If they were named Dandakar, we knew they came from Danda Rajpuri. If they were Divakar, they came from Div Borli, and so on. When we looked at some of the synagogues, first of all, in some of the places we had trouble finding them. When our guide didn't know them, he knew most of them, so we didn't have any trouble. And we tried to say Jewish temple, Beni Israel, nobody knew what we were talking about. When we said Israel Masjid, in other words, like a Muslim house of worship, everybody knew where it was in this place. People were very friendly. Many of these places, like Masla, had a lot of Muslims in them. When we came out looking for the synagogue, every person, every Muslim who came there, so looking for the synagogue, insisted upon walking us. They said, why did the Jews live? We were very happy with them here, and so on and so forth. And you see, in order to get into the synagogue, you've got to go past a Muslim merchant. And inside there was building a alleyway to the building, and the building has been totally restored. There are no Jews there. The key is with somebody in Mumbai, but they've restored this place, and it's been rededicated, as you can see from this service that was held there. And even though most of the Beni Israel are in Israel today, they don't forget their roots. This custom started in the 19th century when Beni Israel, many of them were soldiers, took their money and built synagogues in the 19th century within Janjira state, even though they lived elsewhere. And now in the 20th century, the preservation of these synagogues is being kept up by the Beni Israel of Israel. This synagogue was constructed on land donated by a military pensioner. Many of the leaders of the Jewish community were in fact military men. And the Jews, the Bene Israel, were overrepresented in the armies and navies of various Indian principalities and the British Indian Army. This is another synagogue, and you notice the trilingual inscription, which is on the outside of it. And you reach this synagogue through a gate to a courtyard. You can also reach it from the other side on the one Jewish man who still lives there and maintains the synagogue. So how did they get along with Hindus and Muslims? You know, Hindus and Muslims had a lot of problem. Muslims and Jews have had a lot of problem. How did the Bene Israel think? The land was divided between Hindus and Janjira. Janjira was a Muslim place. There were a number of groups which are usually linked under the name Marathas, which were Hindu groups, although some of them were not Marathas, like the Peshwa leader was not a Maratha, he was Brahmin, and so on. So whose side were the Jews on and who liked the Jews? This area, Tala, it used to be in the territory of Janjira, Muslim territory. And it was right on the border. After a while, it was taken over by the Marathas. And there lived in this place called Tala, a rich oil presser, Shlomo. And the Muslim and Hindu leaders both liked him. And the Hindus was reported to the Hindu leader, the Peshwa, that Shlomo was conspiring to overthrow Hindu rule. And they took him to the court and they wanted his head to be smashed by an elephant. When he was thrown at the feet of the mad elephant, he kept on repeating the prayer of refuge, the Shema. The elephant picked him up in his trunk and rescued him. And the Hindus said his innocence was proven and he was given a special chair of honor. So this is the only instance I find of any persecution of Jews. But even this was not as a Jew. It was, in fact, the Marathas. I haven't found one single incident of any sort of negativity towards Jews by the Marathas. The Jews served in both armies and navies, among the Muslims, Janjira, and the Marathas. The Maratha Navy was under the influence of these people called the archivist. And there were two members of a family, the Sharakat family, who came from Angria's territory, but they were officers in the Janjira fleet. When they were captured in a battle by the Hindu Angrias, they refused to desert the Nawab of Janjira. The Hindu leader was so impressed that he appointed two other brothers from the family to his navy, and another member of the family became a commander of the Hindu fleet. The Jews were working as soldiers and sailors and so on and so forth. And very often the Bene Israel are talked about in terms of their being Saturday oil men. But I think it would be better to say that they were very often soldiers. Typical what happened is in about 1760, 5 brothers from Janjira, the Divakar brothers, joined the British forces. And in the 18th century, a huge percentage of the native officers of Bombay were, in fact, Bene Israel, far outnumbering the number in the community. And one of these, fighting for the British against the Mysore Sultan, Tipu Sultan, was captured. And according to the story, the Sultan's mother said she wanted to see a Bene Israel because they're mentioned favorably in the Quran, and therefore his life was spared. He was responsible for the building of the first Bene Israel synagogue, 1796, after his death. And it was in Bombay, and the first synagogues were in Bombay. He had tried to get a Torah from Cochin and died there. And it wasn't until, I think, 1840 or something that one of the other Bombay synagogues had a Torah case. His family continued military service, the Divakars, and one of them that I'm very interested in, because I'm writing about Jews in Bollywood and Jews in theater, is David Hayam Divakar, because he was an important poet and dramatist of the 19th century in Marathi drama. There were three families of hereditary qazis, or judges. The Rajput family was one of them. He came from Janjira. One of the members was the chief of the mission schools under a missionary called John Wilson, who translated books from Hebrew into Marathi. And that man's son became Professor Jovaziko Rajpukar, became professor of Hebrew at Bombay University. And here's an example of one of his books. Another member of the family was a physician who became mayor of Bombay. And those of you who know Bombay or Mumbai may have passed Dr. E. Moses Road, which is named after him. The Jews from Janjira spread all over India, and they helped create a community in Ahmedabad in Gujarat, the Dandekar family. And one of the prominent members of that family was Reuben David, who founded the zoo. And he is famous as an animal talker. And he had a monkey and a tiger who I think was said to be good friends. And there is his daughter with her pet. And she's grown up to be a great novelist, Esther David, about Jewish life in India. And she's also an artist. One of the most prominent families who originated from Janjira was the Wargarkar family, or the Israel family. They were known as both. And three members of this family became chief ministers of different Indian states. There were two brothers, Shalom Bapaji Israel, and he became the Karbari of Janjira in the 1890s. And his brother, Jacob Bapaji Israel, became the chief minister of a Hindu state called Aland. Shalom's son, Chaim, became the chief minister of another state called Akukut. He's the small guy to the right of the Englishman. The family, the Wargarkar family, Israel family, were also very important in Jewish communal affairs. There's a cartoon about them. And here's the important Jewish communal things of the 1920s, edited by Joseph Bapaji Israel. In later days, two other members of the family were very important. There was Admiral Chippy Sampson. And Admiral Chippy Sampson was, we see the picture of him in the upper right greeting Nasser. And of course, it was a Beni Israel pilot who brought Nasser in. So the Jews were deputized to greet Nasser. And of course, Chippy's, Sampson's, one of his best friends was another general, a Muslim general named Habibullah. Another member of the Wargarkar family was Annie Sampson, and she was first principal of the Anjuman-e-Islam Tayapshi School for Girls in Bombay. So just picture this, in the 1930s, she is going to conservative Muslim homes, a Jewish woman, and she's trying to convince these parents to send their girls to school. And she's still honored today by the school. I should say something more about the Tayapshis in a minute. You'll see how this all comes together. I want to tell you what the school is like today. We have an unfortunate thing in America to equate practicing religion with intolerance of other people. I think that's unfortunate and unfair. And if you go to the Tayapshi school, as I did with my family, you see the girls greeting us and putting on a whole performance of different acts, including the girls getting dressed up as Ashkenazi Jews and dancing the Hora for us. Where else but India could you see this? And I'm so grateful to Dr. Kazi, who's in the upper right-hand corner there, who is he was the head of Anjuman Islam, which has over 100,000 students in various schools, and the principal of the Annie Sampson School, our dear friend, Shama. And there's another performance in honor of Annie Sampson, the English contest. So I studied the school is known as the Tayabshi School. So who were these Tayabshis? They were Bohra Muslims. They were kind of Muslim, and they were a great liberal family. One of the members of the family was one of the first presidents of the Indian National Congress. And one of the members of the family, the Faizi family, married the African Nawab of Janjira. She was, of course, not an African, she was a Muslim. And she was sent in at a particular time. There had been total chaos and disorder as the state no longer was powerful. And her husband had been sent off to a new school for princes modeled after Eton called Raj Kumar College. He was a very erudite young man. And she was a 13-year-old girl sent to marry this 28-year-old man. Her sister married the Beni Israel artist, writer, Faizi Rahami. So again, we have two sisters, one married to an African Muslim ruler, and the other married to a fellow who was born into the Beni Israel community. These sisters were tremendous feminists. The Queen of Janjira, the Begum of Janjira, was seen as the only emancipated queen of the Muslim world. Her name was Nazli. And her sister, Atiya, was a very famous feminist who was one of the first Muslim women to come out of seclusion. And she was a great authority on Indian music. In the early days, the Queen Nazli and the African ruler Ahmed Khan got along famously. They went on a tremendous trip to Europe, and Nazli wrote this glorious biography of her husband and how everybody, even King George V, even though he was a minor prince, they all wanted to be with him because they all loved him and how articulate he was. After his death and long after they were alienated, what she wrote to Queen Mary was totally different. Nazli's sister, Atiya, married Faizi Rahami, the Beni Israel artist, and they were known as the Faizi sisters, and he took her name. He became Faizi Rahami. His original name was Seema Toko Rahami. This marriage was attended by, from left to right, the two figures on the left are the Nawab of Janjira, and next to him, the Gaikwar, or the Maharaja of Baroda, one of the most powerful princes. And both Faizi and his wife Atiya worked for the Gaikwar Baroda, who was their patron. He took her name, Faizi took her name, he took her religion, and later he wrote this feminist novel copying Nazli's charges against her late husband, the Nawab. So I say he became a Muslim. At first, his style was very academic. He had studied under people like Sargent, a Western artist, and you see the picture that he made of the Maharani. Notice the staircase with the cobra on it. Then he did a lot of religious pictures. And so I said he was a Jew, became a Muslim. So of course, what religious pictures would you expect? Buddha. And the picture on the right, three women are admiring a picture of Krishna, that's Hindu. In the picture on the left-hand side, you see among others, Zoroaster and Moses. Together, they worked on this amazing book. Atiya wrote about the music of India, and Faizi made these wonderful paintings, which are in some of the great museums of the musical modes or rags. Faizi also painted his sister-in-law, Nazli on her throne. It's a beautiful, beautiful painting. And supposedly she had a fairy existence. He painted her in her swan boat as the fairy queen. And there's a wonderful poem written by India's leading female freedom fighter, the poet Sarojini Naidu. Sarojini Naidu, the Nightingale of India, about her beautiful island and what a beautiful idyllic existence they have. Now, Leslie was disgusted by hunting and war. The idea of hunting in her palace, she came, the place that they were living on the island, of course, had all these shields and animal trophies and swords and so on and so forth. She didn't like that. And today in the new palace, there's only one stuffed animal, but I'm sure that must have come after the time she was there, because she would not have allowed this. And she built this new fairy castle just not far from the water. And in it, this is the beautiful audience hall. And you see on the right, the ivory throne of the African Nawab. The detailing is amazing. And she played a big role in this, having been influenced by the fact that she spent her early days in Constantinople. There's a lot of Turkish influence in the palace. But then there was trouble in paradise. She didn't have any children, and the Nawab insisted upon taking a second wife, and he took a wife from the African community. And she was absolutely outraged and left her husband and went to Bombay, where she stayed with her brother-in-law and her two sisters. After he died, the Nawab died in 1922, she was involved in these terrible court battles. Janjira state said, "He divorced you." She said, "I was never divorced." And then he said, "Well, he did this things and he did this and so on and so forth." Said, "I never was contacted." And even though he was a Sunni, she said that any divorce had to meet Shia standards. And of course, her appeals in courts were not successful. One important thing here in terms of our story is in the court battle, Janjira state was very hostile to her. They saw her as, said she became a place of refuge. What I mean refuge, they must have meant to the enemies of the state. And having obtained possession of the state jewels and be guided by Mr. Samuel, a Jew who has married his sister, she appears to squander away the whole of it. What they did do is they built this amazing palace in Malabar Hill, the most exclusive part of Bombay, and they held wonderful literary salons. Nasli then wrote this long typed letter to Queen Mary against men, that men should not be rulers, and that they were all terrible, and they were all drug addicts, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. And she specifically made a lot of charges against her husband, many of which were untrue, because I have the documents that show that they weren't true. But what was created out of this was Faizi's amazing feminist novel, Gilded India, which is not known today, which is an amazing portrayal of how Indian rulers would be different than male rulers. And I'm still waiting for this to be rediscovered. She took credit for everything that happened in good in the state, though there's reasons to think that that isn't the case. Meanwhile, Faizi made a great career for himself. His murals were in the Imperial Secretariat. He was a consultant to museums in New York. He had shows in London, New York. His plays were in New York. He created poetry. At the time of partition, Faizi, his sister-in-law and his wife came to Karachi, where they were supposed to build a Faizi Rahameen art gallery in Karachi. And there in the wall, you see the picture of his sister-in-law, and on either side, the picture that he drew of his wife and the portrait of himself. So you're saying to yourself, one renegade Jew in Pakistan, how many do you think there were of people of Jewish origin in Pakistan who had tremendous influence? And these are the things that I'm bringing out. So let's take artists, for example. A British artist, Anna Malka, was a famous painter in Pakistan. In this 6-panel painting, you see a rabbi in the second panel to the left, and you see everybody blowing themselves up. and we're going back to the Stone Age. And it's a plea against warfare and so on and so forth. And she was on a Pakistani stamp, as you can see up here. So you say, well, those were secular people. What about Islam? What about Jews in Islam? There are two. Leopold Weiss, who took the name Muhammad Assad. This is a 2-volume thing, Europe's Gift to Islam, with the Jewish Star in it, which was given to me by the Pakistani Ministry of Culture, who sponsored it. There's another book that was sponsored by the Saudi government for the conference that they held in his honor. There is Muhammad Assad as the #2 man in Pakistan's United Nations delegation, where he hobnobbed with his cousin, whose husband was in the Israeli delegation, believe it or not. And there he is on a Pakistani stamp. He also made one of the great translations of the Quran. And his book, The Road to Islam, is a book usually read by young seekers in the West who are somehow entranced with Islam. It's even true today. One of the biggest callers for a clash of civilization between Islam and the rest of the world was Miriam Jamela, who was born Margaret Marcus. And so in the new book that I'm talking about, I picked 5 Jews ranging back to the 15th century who became Muslims, and including one of the most important Sufis, 2 of the most important Sufis to discuss. But we have poor Miriam Jamela, who's calling for a clash of civilizations. This will give you the idea that Pakistan was very friendly towards Jews, which is totally untrue. Oh, I forgot to add that the present Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan's former wife, was a British Jew. There was a Jewish community in Karachi. There's a synagogue. With partition coming, they all had to leave, and they all left. And Pakistan made a terrorist attack on Mumbai. They singled out a Jewish site. Here are the bullet holes, including the bullet holes in a prayer book. So I don't mean to imply that this whole story is very simple. And I hope that we will have days where Muslims and Jews and everybody else get along better, and that we promote all the people who are working for those goals. Thank you.
Wow, Ken, that was amazing. A lot of information. We had few comments. Rachel Daniels said that one of the ladies in the photo of the sisters with the 2 brothers in the back is her great grandmother, married to Dr. Judah Haim Masilker. So this is from Rachel. Thank you, Rachel. And Ran Amitai is talking about the synagogue in Delhi, which is named after Dr. Judah Haim.
I mean, there are so many accomplishments that the Beni Israel did. And we have all these stereotypes. We have stereotypes that Jews are always business people. Now, you can make a whole history of Indian Jewry talking about trade diasporas. I have documentation that's conclusive back to the 9th century. And people say that it existed before that. But the largest Jewish community in India was not known for this. They were known for their military prowess. They were doctors. They were civil servants. They worked on the railroads, many different things, but they were not business people. And I think that stereotypes that we have, whether it's of Jews or Muslims, really are unfair. And, you know, there are people who are working very hard. I mean, I can see my friend, Dr. Zahir Kazi, and he is working very hard to create religious Muslims with tremendous respect for everybody. And another friend of mine in the Sufi shrine in Ajmer says, with malice towards none and love towards all. And that is the basis for which they run this Sufi shrine. And so you go and you see tens of thousands of non-Muslims coming to seek solace at this shrine, at a Muslim shrine.
There's a question from Rafi asking, how did you get interested in research on the Bnei Israel community in India?
My chief interest was in Maharajas and Nawabs. And every time I go anyplace, there's always a Jew somewhere. So if you go to Cochin, you see the thing. You go to Travancore, there was a synagogue in Travancore State. If you go to Aound, there's a Jewish prime minister. And what I saw is that the trajectory of accomplishments of Jews across India was so great. We have so many stories to tell. Right now, nobody likes refugees. Refugees, it's not high on anybody's list. And what we're missing out, if we take the story of the Jewish refugees that were housed during the Holocaust in India, one sees the transformational effects that they had on art, medicine, housing, architecture, and so on. And we have to really work to say that rescuing other people is important.
There's another question from Esther da Costa asking, did this group, Africans, Muslim, and Jews, did they borrow any cultural traits from the other, one another, the way the Baghdadi Jews and the Bnei Israel did? You showed examples in the art, but is there any borrowed things in the customs?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the answer is yes. But if I start to answer that, I'm just going to confuse people and get into contentious areas. In one of the books, we're doing these 3 books on Islam, Jews, and Muslims. We will talk about the questions of a particular type of ceremony associated with the Bnei Israel community, the Melita ceremony, and how some of the customs may have come from a particular Muslim holy man or peer. So we will get into those kind of things in writing when we can document it.
Okay. There's someone, Ruben Yosef, that wants to contact you. So Ruben, you can get the contact details and email from me later on.
Please.
Any more questions? Janjira's called these Bnei Israelis as Emusai followers of Moses?
I don't, what was shocking, I just had another research. I'd been through myself to the British Library to see all the documents that they had on Janjira. And I had more than they did. It was really very sad how little we know about the life that was there. And the reason for this is that when the Navy of Janjira was no longer modern and competitive, there was nothing in the state. It was just chaos. And people were very poor. For Jews, it meant that they went elsewhere. They went to Bombay, they went to the British, the East India Company Army, and so on and so forth. They went and founded new communities in Karachi and in Ahmedabad, and even Jubalpur, and so on. But unfortunately, we don't really have, I mean, I thought if the guy was prime minister for a couple of years, and there was even a road between, I think it was between Murad and Srivadan, named after the Jewish prime minister, that I should be able to find out more about their relationship. And I didn't.
Okay. Amy Kathleen is asking, did you read the book of 1000 Questions, Medieval Arabic, in which a rabbi asked a prophet during his last year 10,000 questions, and the 10,000 question, the last question, the rabbi converts to Islam? Did you read that book?
It was Amy Caitlin who said that?
Yes, she's asking a question.
gotta go to her to the answer to that question, but I just want to say that I have to tell you about her late husband and an experience I had with her late husband. He was a Muslim, Nazir Jarazid. He was the first person who did the ethnomusicology on the Jews of Cochin. And we had to meet once in Bombay. And what happened is that the only place we could meet was the synagogue. And so they were waiting around for 10 Jews. And since he knew all about it, he was speaking a little bit of Hebrew to them, and he talked about the music and so on. They thought he was Jewish, and they started the ceremony. So he was the 10th, the Jew in the minyan.
Yeah. Melek is asking, did you find evidence of religious books other than prayer books written by non-Kochini Jews in India? Was there any knowledge of the Talmud, details of Shabbat laws, or any other liturgical issues? Oh, Ken, we got you back.
Right, I could hear you, but some reason I couldn't unmute.
Okay.
I heard everything that was going on.
So there's a lot of compliments in the chat and a few more questions that are written here. The last question was, did you find any evidence on religious books other than prayer books written by non-Kochini Jews in India? Was there any knowledge of the Talmud, details of Shabbat laws, and other non-liturgical issues?
No, I haven't seen anything of that sort. I mean, there are things, for example, there was a Jew associated with a Hindu group, a Baghdadi, who wrote about Samad, who was a Jewish Sufi, that kind of thing. And the most interesting thing was that the Idrizuda, which is an esoteric Kabbalistic text, was first published in India by a Baghdadi who wanted to impress the Theosophist. So, and I think that the thing that is the most interesting is I couldn't make a list of Jews so far who really contributed in a major way, except maybe people like Raj Pukar, who translated a lot of the things into Marathi. But yet I could make this huge line of people who contributed to Islam who were born Jewish, which I thought was very extraordinary, that in India, of all places, that this should happen. And most of these were non-Indian Jews.
Okay. There is another question by Geva that he feels that this heritage of the Bnei Israel is not sufficiently predominated in Israel in the post-Aliyah community, and how can we reach this knowledge? And I think that Amy is giving him some answers about a book that was published, so it's all in the chat. Sharona is talking about a great-grandfather, Eliezer Dandeker, that was laid the plumbing of the town of Murad Janjira. He laid the plumbing. And let's see what else we have here. Could you tell us a little more about the Sufi Jewish connection?
There are two things that are very important. You said, how do you become interested in this? I was minding my own business, which was trying to find out whether the sultans of Jaunpur in the 14th and 15th century were or were not Africans. I still don't know what they are. And I came across it that one of the sultans had this huge fight with a Sufi who, according to the author, had been born a Jew in Aleppo. Saw some references to the community that he founded. He founded one of the largest Sufi orders in India, the Madhya Sufis. So then I located the 17th century saint's biography of this fellow, and they describe him as being a purest of Abraham and Aaron, of Moses and Aaron. And there's talk in it about his Talmud education, and he came, and he's buried in near Kanpur in a place called Makanpur. So I contacted the group, and they've been very kind to me. On the other hand, they don't accept this. and they think it's wrong. And so I thought maybe, they're embarrassed by this or something. But it turns out that the guy who wrote this tended to make up stuff. So I don't know whether it's true or not. I did learn that you take any founder of a religious group and you can create any image of that person in your own way. So this fellow Shah Mada was known for riding on a lion with snakes in his hand. He was a powerful guy. He always was veiled because he had such a powerful countenance. And to this day, in his shrine in Makanpur, Hindus and Muslims come for the annual festival. And there are literally hundreds of shrines to Shah Mada all over India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and I think even Sri Lanka. And one of the Madhya Sufis was one of the most important leaders in what some people consider the first Indian war for independence. Not the famous one of 1857, 1858, but a war before that, which was fought in East India. And his name was Majnu Shah. So that's an important group. And in the book, that's one of the things we'll talk about. The second one was a fellow named Samad. Samad came from Kashan. He was said to be an Armenian Jew. He came and he attached himself to two royal courts, the second of which was the Mughal court. And he was one of the adherents of the heir apparent to the fellow who built the Taj Mahal. And he composed hundreds of these great Sufi poems. And he was killed by his patron's brother. The two brothers had a fratricidal war. Samad liked to lie naked on the steps of the mosque in Delhi. And so I hope the next time to tell you more about that. The third one that's important is Shai Ben-Zor, who's an Israeli, who's associated with the Sufis in Ajmer, who is a great singer of various types of music, including the Islamic religious music, the Wali music. And it would be wonderful for you to have him sing. He's really a lot of fun.
We will have him at some point.
Look, the thing that I'm really concerned about is how do we get the history of India out? Not only the things that are wrong with India, but the things that were right about India. I'm very meticulous. I can tell you almost every negative anti-Semitic thing was ever done against a Jew in India. And it really doesn't add up to very much. And it's striking that in small communities of Jews were able to survive. When you consider the problems with assimilation and conversion, the problems with prejudice and so on and so forth, it is amazing that these small Jewish communities survive for hundreds of years. It's frankly a miracle.
Okay, there's another question about Parsis and Jews. Were there any connections? Beroz is asking, and he's asking that since there was Zoroaster that was represented in one of the paintings.
Yes, yes, Zoroaster was represented in one of Faizi Rahman's paintings because he put all religions together. It's an important pointing, and we have not had an exhibit, even though in places like the Yale Art Gallery and the Tate, there are examples of Faizi Rahman's paintings. And of course, in the Faizi Rahman Art Gallery in Karachi, we need an exhibit of this man. There are two Jewish artists, he's one of them, who were very prominent in their day, who nobody's ever heard of. Another one, Magda Nachman, who came to India in the 1940s. She was the person who I think caught the Indian soul more than anybody else. So there's that. Back to the question about the Parsis. The major connections is that the Baghdadi Jews and the Parsis were business communities. And if you can go to Bombay, and there's a hospital, and it's named after a Parsi, and there's a wing that was established by a Baghdadi Jew. Also, in many of the other philanthropic things, if you go over a list, if you see a letterhead for this organization, that organization, you'll find the Sassoons alongside a lot of the Parsis. The Parsis were much more numerous in Bombay.
Okay, there's another question by Ran, but with your permission, I will answer Ran. Ran is asking if you can tell us anything about the Jewish community in Lahore, Pakistan, during the 19th and early 20th centuries. And my answer to Ran is that we are going to have a talk about it, so I won't allow Ken to do a spoiler. So you'll have to join us again to that talk on the Jewish community in Pakistan.
We're publishing a whole book, which will cover, Sifra Lenton, who is a Jew from Beni Israel in Mumbai, is writing about this for the book.
Rachel is asking, how do you define a Jewish Sufi?
This is always a question. Is something that a Jew does that make it Jewish? Is something, I keep on asking the question to myself. I can't define who's a Jew, who's not a Jew, who's that. I try to bring everybody in, but it's not for me to say. What we're basically talking about is a person who was born as a Jew, who becomes involved in the Sufi movement. And I mean, the most famous person who was Jewish, who was involved in other religions, is somebody called the Mother. And she created this whole town, Oroville, near Pondicherry. And she was a French Jew, but her family came from the Ottoman Empire. And she's a direct descendant of one of the greatest of all rabbis, the Rif, the North African rabbi. And here she is, the founder of a new kind of neo-Islamic movement, the neo-Hindu movement, excuse me.
Yeah. Okay, great. Rafi is asking if you can point us a few sources of information on the Bnei Israel of India, any books, any articles. And I think that's it, guys. That will be the last question and answer. If you want to be updated, please write your emails as while Ken is giving the answer.
Well, obviously, one recommends my own book, Jews of the Deccan, by Kennet X, Robbins, R-O-B-B-I-N-S, and Pushkar Sahani, S-O-H-O-N-I, which is a detailed history of the synagogues and other Jewish sites in Bombay, Pune, and the Congo.
Okay.
I'm sorry for the interruptions. I shouldn't have kept
No,
the phone.
that's okay. That's okay. I'll give an answer to Chaim. I'll try to get Jews of Afghanistan, although this is Indian Jewish heritage, but if there's any connection and interest, we will get that as well.
Can I just say about that? You know, one of the things that happened during World War II is that not only were Jewish refugees escaping Hitler, there were Jewish refugees escaping in Iraq, the pogrom, the Farhud, 1941, and also times were very bad for the Jews in the 1930s and 40s, and a whole bunch of Afghan Jews were on the lawn of a synagogue in Bombay.
Okay.
Afghan Jews, yes.
Yeah. Okay, guys, that's it for today.